thank you for coming back from lunch to the afternoon sessions here in our Psych Sessions New Year's Extravaganza Podference. You know how it is sometimes at a conference. You go to lunch, you start having conversations about the morning sessions, and then you just never wander back. And so the great thing about a Podference is that this episode was waiting for you as you came back. And so you can download it anytime and extend your lunch period as long as you would like. And so I'm so pleased to introduce really our next conversation. It's featuring Dr. Rob McEntarffer from Lincoln Public Schools in Lincoln, Nebraska. And Rob is an assessment evaluation specialist with Lincoln Public Schools. So what's special about that is that he has a large audience that he serves with a number of other evaluation specialists, coordinators, and other support staff members. The Lincoln Public School System serves over 42,000 students in more than 60 schools and programs. And so he is a full-time specialist that thinks about assessment in a deep way. Other things I want to tell you about Rob is that Rob has a regular blog that he writes about these types of issues. It's called Not for Points. And so if you were to just Google him and look for Not for Points, you could find some of his deep thoughts about that topic. He's also, in 2015, gave a TEDx talk, TEDx Lincoln, as well. So one of the things that we roped Rob into, this is actually not an invited address per se, but it's more of an informal chat that happened during the Southwestern Psychological Association, or SWAPA, meeting in 2019. So Rob is who I believe really one of the national experts in something that's called single diagnostic assessment, or single diagnostic test item assessment. And I kind of gently coerced him to go to SWAPA in 2019 and give like an hour and a half, 2-hour workshop, which he did. And you know, SWAPA is one of these conferences, like many of the regionals, where it's like Friday, Saturday, and like 3 hours on Sunday. And so I wasn't really thinking about the scheduling, and I think he gave like a 90 or 120-minute workshop, and it was scheduled for the Sunday morning. And sadly, I booked my flights to go home on Sunday, and so I didn't get to hear the workshop that I kind of gently twisted his arm to give. And so Garth was there as well. We hit record on the Psych Sessions travel gear, and we were lucky enough to get Rob to sit down and have this informal chat about single diagnostic testing as well as other topics in the assessment world, and we recorded that. And so this is a conversation with Rob McEntarffer from Lincoln Public Schools. It was originally recorded on April 5th, 2019 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. To be technically correct, it was not part of the SWAPA program, but Rob was there to be talking, and he would give a talk that Sunday morning of SWAPA about this very topic. And so we hope you enjoy this informal conversation as part of our podcast extravaganza. I am thrilled to be here in Albuquerque, New Mexico with two of my favorite buddies. I am here with Rob McEntarffer and Garth Neufeld, and we get a chance to talk about assessment. And so this is a special edition of Psych Sessions. We'll call it Assessment Sessions.
Now, I'm glad that we get an opportunity to sit down with Rob, but why don't you tell, Eric, maybe you could tell the story. How did Rob get here to Albuquerque? And why are we doing this in a hotel room and maybe not live in person?
Well, we don't do a lot of podcasts live. We've only done a live recording just once. So here's the thing. I talked Rob. We're going to let Rob talk here in about 5 or 10 minutes. I actually talked Rob into coming to SWPA in 2019 to give a workshop or a talk about single diagnostic assessment items, because he's written book chapters. Rob, where did you give a talk about? You gave a talk about this somewhere.
Long time ago at ACT in Atlanta.
Was it a very long
STP
talk?
event in Atlanta. I believe it was an hour talk, I think.
And
But it was quite a while ago.
You gave a talk about it, and you've written a couple of book chapters about it. It's very intriguing. I wanted to know more. And so I read everything that you've written about it, and I've been dying to hear more about it. So I talked you into it, and unfortunately, by timing, you're going to give a talk. And Garth, I love you and hate you both at the same time. You're going to give a talk the Sunday morning of SWAPA at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I will already be in Denver on my way home to Boise, so I'm going to miss it. So thank you both for maybe placating me to sit down and get a mini advanced version of your talk tomorrow morning.
You bet. I took a picture of the program because I thought it was pretty funny. It's almost the last thing of the entire SWPA conference.
Well, I was wondering who maybe you offended. Maybe it was years ago. Somebody has a long memory and put you into that spot.
I don't know if it's that, but maybe this is kind of. I don't think it's backhanded, but assessment doesn't get the attention it deserves.
Well, that's interesting.
It's an important piece of what educators do to know that they are being effective. However, it's not popular. I've given a lot of talks about assessment. In the things that I do around the country, I often have assessment as part of my slides and things. I stopped putting assessment in the titles of my talks because if I have assessment in the title of my talks, I know I'm going to get a smaller audience than if I don't. And so I don't know. I don't know if the people at SWAPA put you Sunday morning, dark 30, because that was the place to tuck you away. But it's an interesting choice.
I'm just going to chalk it up to luck of the draw, and that's just fine. There will be a small but dedicated audience ready to talk about single diagnostic items. And there are two other interesting-looking papers that are being presented at the same time.
Well, and I can tell you, it's not only luck of the draw, because I had a spot at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning to give a talk, and I told them I had to fly out at 9 a.m. So actually, I think I might have offended somebody to be put into that slot originally, and maybe it was just luck of the draw.
Yeah, and the other odd thing, and we should move off of this, is that it's not like there's a whole morning from 8 to noon.
No.
It's like 8 to 10, and then it's done.
Yeah.
So, Rob, could you just tell our audience a little bit about how you became the assessment guru that you are?
I don't know if I like the title, but I also want to not check my privilege, but acknowledge privilege, because my background is a high school psychology teacher, AP and non-AP psychology teacher, and now I'm an administrator in our district, and I still help our psych teachers in our district.
What district would that be?
I'm sorry, Lincoln Public Schools in beautiful Lincoln, Nebraska. And SWPA and these other regional conferences, I doubt that many, if any, high school teachers generally come to them, right? Not a big part of the audience?
Sometimes the local regional will reach out in the city. It depends.
It also seems to me like if there is a big high school, if there is a big group of high school teachers who already meet on a regular basis, that they might show up more often.
Yeah,
because that culture's there.
Right. Putting this out there for anybody who might be listening to it, who wants to be innovative with one of these regional conferences, I think it might be an opportunity. The high school psychology teachers' outlet for these sorts of conversations are pretty limited. And also high school psychology teachers are awfully isolated. So they crave these sorts of conversations. SWPA, as far as I've experienced so far, is a nice small conference. If you want to be focused on teaching, you can be focused on teaching. If you want to focus on canine research, you can focus on canine research. There's a hissing cockroach presentation. So there's a wide variety, but a lot of teaching presentations. And I think high school teachers might get a lot out of it. Right now, if a high school teacher wants this sort of conversation, they would have to go to a national conference like National Conference of Teachers of Social Studies, where a part of it is going to be devoted to psychology, but definitely not most of it. Or they can go to APA. If they can get funding to go to APA, it's a pretty big commitment, but there's a lot of good programming at APA. And APA and TOPS do several opportunities during the summer. And Garth, I know you have some high school teachers coming to your conference this summer, which is awesome. So just putting it out there. I think high school teachers would love this format. It's not overpopulated. I think SWEPA and regional conferences could use more human beings, and I think high school teachers might be a good audience.
The other piece, Rob, that you remind me of is that I know RMPA, when we travel to different cities in the Rocky Mountain region, we do actually try to reach out to high school teachers. And we know that sometimes the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, it's hard for teachers to get that Friday and that Thursday and Friday, the high school teachers to get that time off. So what we've started doing is having a special pricing for Saturday only, because we know it's a little bit easier for them to get the Saturday to come to a Saturday only convention. So I think conferences can do things that appeal for the continuing education credits and also for high school teachers.
So where were we on the assessment guru stuff that you tried to avoid?
Well, if you're not one, then who the hell is?
Right.
All right, going back to the assessment being a bad word, what you said before, I've experienced that too, and I've stopped putting assessment in the titles of presentations, things like that. The second slide in the presentation that I'm going to do tomorrow is from Chronicle of Higher Education, and the headline is "Assessment is an Enormous Waste of Time," which is pretty blunt and also pretty weird given the fact that we're all teachers and we spend a bucket load of time doing assessment. I think some of that time we acknowledge is time doing assessment, and it might not be our favorite things. Grading and scoring tests generally don't top professors' and teachers' lists of favorite parts about the gig. Thinking more broadly about assessment, and this is the part of assessment that I'm more interested in, I think every teacher would also say that they're pretty much constantly, or they think they are constantly checking for students' understanding. The reason we want to be in the same place at the same time as our students, rather than just putting lecture videos out there on TeacherTube or YouTube, the reason we want to be there, I think, is so that we can look them in the eyes, so we can ask them to do something, so we can throw questions out there and get responses, so we can have discussions. The goal of all those things, I think the only reason we do them, probably some for student engagement, maybe, but the primary reason we do all of those teacher behaviors is to check for student understanding, which is just a form of assessment, whether we want to call it that or not. Assessment is gathering information about students' level of skill, level of understanding. And the assessments are tools we use to do that.
I love what you said, and I don't know if I've thought about it that way before, that being face-to-face with students, assessment is looking in their eyes and saying, did that click?
Yeah. And we can be super overconfident about that. I mean, there's limitations to
Certainly.
that. It's a powerful tool, but also potentially powerfully misleading tool too. We should all know about overconfidence, and we should all know about the curse of knowledge and how easy it is to fool ourselves. So we want to do that, but we also want to gather assessment data more carefully and systematically so we can prove to ourselves that we're not fooling ourselves about our level of student understanding. I mean, if anybody should be able to think critically and use data about student understanding so that we don't end up fooling ourselves in our classes, it should be psychology folks.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you. However, your definition is elegant and it's correct. I do tweak it for myself a little bit, and I don't want to muddy the waters too much. But for me, grading data is about helping a student understand how he or she is performing on a task or in an assignment. Assessment data is for me to understand how I am performing in the classroom helping students. And when carefully designed, grade data can help contribute to assessment data, but they are not necessarily the same data, but they can be sourced from carefully designed assignments with well-designed rubrics.
I think I see where you're going with the distinction, but I'm going to push back on it a little bit. And I bet if we think of assessment as the task or the tool, so I have assessment tasks or I have assessment tools, and I use that to gather information about levels of student understanding or skill. How I use that information, I think, creates the distinction that you created. It's not the tools that are necessarily distinct or mutually exclusive. I think you could use just about any of those tools for different purposes. If I use it for the purpose of entering student grades because I have to give them grades, then I'm using it for a grading purpose. If I use that same data for the purpose of improving my instruction, changing a lesson plan, identifying misconceptions to attack the next time, then I'm using it for a different purpose.
Yeah,
and you can actually do both at the same time, right? I can use it for grading information, and I can use it for being a responsive teacher.
You can indeed, but the reason I like separating it because when I talk to teachers of psychology, and those are the only teachers I really talk to, they think that because they're grading, they're assessing. They have assessment data. So when they put an 84 at the top of a paper that's worth 100 points, that's grade data back to the student. But that 84 does not tell them anything about how to be a better teacher. If they had used a rubric with 3 different rubric levels and they ran a rubric report in Blackboard that told them where their students were struggling the most, then that becomes assessment data for them that tells them the next time I use this assignment, I see where my students are struggling the most. I might come in with a different pedagogical approach the following semester. That now is assessment data, and that's why I separate it for me. That's the grade data helps the student improve. The assessment data helps me improve, even though you're right. It's the exact same data. But I understand that when we all disagree on definitions, it muddies the waters and it makes things more complicated.
It may be a semantic difference that may not ultimately matter. Yeah. Piling more semantic differences that may not ultimately matter across on the top. K-12 folks will be familiar with the term summative assessment and formative assessment, and I think that's really close to what you're talking about. And most definitions will say if you're using assessment data in a summative process, if you're using it to evaluate students, right, primarily with a grade. You're using assessment data in a formative process if you're using it to improve something.
I know a guy, though, who's written a blog or 2 entry very persuasively about how maybe summative and formative aren't very good terms to use.
Yeah, I don't love the terms anymore, but they're out there in the literature, and especially K-12 teachers especially will be really familiar, I bet, with the terms formative and summative assessment.
Is he the guy?
Yeah, he's the guy. Mm-hmm. And aren't those terms even built into grade book labels? So students are talking the talk.
Right.
Parents are talking that talk.
Right. And I think it's interesting that it hasn't penetrated higher education much, right?
Well, it has for me. It's been a nice way to think. I'm just finishing up the tenure process, and it's been a nice way to reflect on my own teaching and kind of going towards those more formative practices. And it gives a language to be able to articulate that to administrators. What I'm actually doing in my class. But I'm sitting here listening to 2 veterans talk about assessment, and I feel like I'm a little bit behind on it. But let me just say that one of the most important things, and I'll tell you why I think I'm a little bit behind on it, is because when you are all talking about these semantics, I'm having trouble really seeing the difference of what you guys are talking about, so I might be missing something. But I don't know who I heard say this, but it really clicked for me years ago that we're always collecting data. If we're grading students, we are always collecting data. Whether we are doing assessment is about whether we're taking that data that we're giving that feedback to students on and doing anything else with it. If we're asking questions about ourselves. When I feel like I'm a community college instructor, I'm not doing SOTL, I'm not that far from it. I'm already collecting all the data, and it's been kind of an excuse to go that extra step to actually start assessment. Now, maybe you can give me some feedback about that perspective and how it aligns with.
I think you nailed it. No matter what we call it, it's probably all about how we're using information about students' levels of skill and knowledge in our classroom. How we as instructors are using that information, and then how we get that information back to students and set up context that increases the chances that they'll use it. Whatever terms we use, that's probably where the action is.
So Garth, let me ask you some questions. I'm being completely serious. I'm not being a jackhole like normal, all right?
Okay.
So you design a meaningful assignment for your class, and you give that assignment, and you score it, all right? Yep. So after you score it, I assume that you might sit and reflect a little bit about how your class did. Is that?
Yeah, of course.
Of course you do.
And sometimes, as an instructor who always wants to improve and sees room for improvement, I wish I had more time to do those things.
Absolutely,
but yes,
of course. And then, do you ever by chance, if you got, let's say that the class performed a little bit less than you had hoped, maybe a lower overall average than you hoped. Maybe at the end of the semester, have you ever done a psych info search on a technique or a procedure, or ever gone to a conference and said over that bar after that dinner, hey, I'm really struggling with this technique I tried. Have you ever talked to your colleagues, or maybe your colleagues at Cascadia? Do you ever do that from time to time?
Yeah, I see where you're going.
Have you ever done that?
Certainly.
And then have you ever gone back that next semester, that next quarter, and then made a little tweak and tried teaching something, and then watched to see if students on that exact same assignment actually improved or made fewer errors in that spot that was rough the quarter before?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the scholars in the literature would call that scholarly teaching. It may not be SOTL, because SOTL would be then going and presenting that at a conference or writing it up for a journal article. But scholarly teaching is that process of using assessment data to improve your practice. Mm-hmm. So that's scholarly teaching. You're taking data, you're reflecting on it. It's action research applied to your own teaching.
It's really that reflective piece, isn't it, that makes it scholarly
it's
teaching?
It's reflection, but then it's also changing your practice. Mm-hmm. You went, you talked to people, you did a lit search, you went to people who've been doing this, and it's that process of plan, act, observe, reflect, and it's that iterative process that makes us better teachers, because we're not satisfied, whether you're 3, 13, or 33 years into a career.
So you just talked about scholarly teaching, and we've talked about SOTL in the same kind of few minutes. Where does assessment fit? Is it an umbrella for both of those?
I bet it's a necessary tool that's involved in any of those processes, involved in all of those processes. Another really timely example, I really enjoyed, Garth, you gave a presentation on inner teaching at the same conference, and I really enjoyed it. Clarified a lot of things. I've read about inner teaching before, but hearing you talk about it really clarified it for me. Assessment and reflecting about what students know, reflecting about the check for understanding, those reading guides, is integral to interteaching. It's the heart and soul of it. That is an example of, I'd probably say assessment, or maybe we would just say checks for understanding. I don't care what we call it. Somehow somebody's figuring out student responses to those really important questions, and looking at student responses to those really important questions, changing your teaching accordingly, and then coming back and having students modify those in order to see what the impact was.
Rob, I think you just nailed it. I don't care what we call it. If calling it assessment makes the world go round, that's great. If we call it summative, formative, whatever, but it's taking data, looking what our students are doing, improving their practice, improving our own practice. Label that however you want.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what are you doing these days, Rob? Like, you're giving this talk tomorrow morning on a one-item, what do you call it? A one-item assessment tool?
The technique is called single diagnostic items.
Okay. Talk to us about it.
Single diagnostic items I learned about them from a researcher named Dylan William and Carolyn Wiley. I believe Dylan William is the one who's continued to talk about them. And if that reference isn't familiar to anybody or some people who are listening to this, I encourage you to look up Dylan William's name. William is spelled with one L. So if you find the Dylan William with one L, you will have found that researcher. Really, really interesting researcher. Single diagnostic items are a rethinking of the multiple choice item format that everybody's really, really familiar with. Traditionally, with multiple choice, as we all know, because we've all written these things, you isolate a concept or an application of a concept. You're targeting a certain spot on Bloom's taxonomy, typically knowledge or application, but if really cleverly you can get into evaluation, maybe you might be able to get into synthesis, but that's really hard. So you write a stem that is focused on what you're trying to measure, whether it's application or knowledge or whatever, and then you create a one and only one correct answer. And then you have to create 3 or 4, depending on how many possible answer choices you want, distractors that force students to make useful distinctions or meaningful distinctions between the correct answer and incorrect answers. So that's the normal, typical, good multiple choice item writing practice. And I think multiple choice items can measure a bunch of stuff really well and really efficiently. I think they can. They have limitations. Once you get up to synthesis, once you get up to performing skills, I think it's pretty goofball to try to measure that sort of thing with a multiple choice item. If we want to know whether students can describe a concept or apply a concept and whether they can use their own words to do it, obviously we're out of multiple choice land.
Yeah, it's always struck me as interesting to hear someone try to. I've actually never heard anyone make the argument that you would measure writing ability by a multiple choice exam. We teach writing and we make students write. Critical thinking, we make them do a project. And actually, writing is not the typical proxy for critical thinking. But Rob, what you just described, that is not the single diagnostic test item.
No. So
Okay,
that's traditional multiple choice item
Okay,
writing.
very
Great.
good.
So it's single diagnostic items are a way to co-opt that format for a different purpose. So it's pretty much where we started this conversation. There's a bunch of different ways to get information about what students know and can do. Then we need to figure out and probably focus more on what we do with that information. So multiple choice items, traditionally, you figure out whether they got it right or wrong, and it's points, and it's percentage, and it's generally for grading purpose. With a single diagnostic item, you change the item writing process slightly, so it empowers you to use the results in a different way. So here's the concept. Tomorrow, in the presentation, I'll introduce single diagnostic item and a little bit about the background, but then I'll ask everybody, and so people listening to this can do this right now. You're all very familiar with intro psych concepts, so right here in the room, the three of us, let's think of a concept, a theory, a something from intro psych that we usually teach that we think is pretty important, that we think students screw up on. So what concept we want to choose as a group.
How about cognitive dissonance?
Awesome. Yeah, cognitive dissonance can be really tricky for students. It's even some of the early studies about cognitive dissonance are even pretty counterintuitive, right?
Absolutely.
And it really throws them.
Yep.
Yeah. And then also in that term, cognitive dissonance, students get a little bit of a hint within the term about what it really means, but not enough of a hint. Right. So we're going to take the term cognitive dissonance. So it satisfies some of the criteria. We think it's a big deal.
And by the way, can we just tell the audience that we didn't predetermine this one in advance?
Nope.
So this one's not prefixed.
This is live.
Right. And we may crash and burn with it. We'll see.
Oh, and then if that's the case, we have edited this out.
Yeah, we'll just delete it.
And we are re-recording this.
So we start with cognitive dissonance. Then the next step is, and this is a pretty ideal situation, the three of us sitting here talking about it. And these are easier to write in a group than they are on their own. So it's a great group activity because what you need is experienced brains. You need brains with different experiences with students, because the next step is, let's list the common ways that students screw this term up. So what are some common misconceptions about cognitive dissonance? So if you just asked your students, point blank, give me your best definition of cognitive dissonance in your own words. The students who don't get it right, how do they go wrong generally? Are there predictable ways they go wrong?
Well, if we're going, sorry, Eric, but if we're going for just on its face, what students might think it is, they might just say it's confusion.
Right. Too big an answer.
Right.
Confusion is related, but it's way too big.
Mm-hmm.
This is the place where you'd want to have access to AP reading responses if it happened to be, one of those items on list one of the 7 bullets.
That's a really cool idea. Going back and analyzing FRQ responses for common misconceptions, you could write some really cool items.
Just give me the access to 200 books, and you could get, 50 decent wrong answers.
That's fascinating. If anybody has a grad student who needs a dissertation topic and College Board is willing to play ball, that could be really cool.
Oh my gosh, yeah. But and that would be a great thing for a department of psychology, all the intro psych instructors to sit around and do, or just if you want to generate some extra credit, ask students in an intro psych class, all right, I'm going to give you 10 terms. Write down the best definition that you have for cognitive dissonance, for operant conditioning, for monocular cues,
That could be really cool. And your talk about inter-teaching really got my gears going. I wonder if you could do that in your inter-teaching groups. Could a probing question for an inter-teaching group be, okay, we all brought our separate answers to this one and we're creating one good group answer. What are some of the bad answers that we brought with us? And why are they bad answers? That might be interesting.
You know what? So back to the cognitive dissonance definition. I'm trying to think about what my students do, and I feel like I should be able to come up with a really quick answer, but this is one of those ones that I don't think they get, they don't get it wrong. They just don't get it all. So they might say something might connect from the reading, like believing one thing and doing another.
Right.
Again, kind of incomplete, right?
Yeah. So let's label those. So let's say first misconception is a student who just thinks cognitive dissonance is a synonym for general cognitive confusion. So that's misconception 1. Misconception 2 is just a disconnect between thinking and doing.
Yep.
That I'm thinking one thing and I'm not telling you why, but I do something else, and that is dissonant. And that's not a complete definition of cognitive dissonance either. That doesn't really connect with the literature. So we have misconception 1, we have misconception 2. Is there a misconception 3?
I'll try. What would a student? Another misconception would be cognitive dissonance is when you are supposed to be able to think about something, but you're unable to do so.
Yeah, so it's an impediment to cognition. I can't really even conceive of it, or I can't think of it, because they're taking the negative sense of that word dissonance and they're just interpreting that as an obstacle or a block or something like that.
I could also see them taking one of the studies that's given in a typical intro psych textbook and then just not understanding it. Maybe giving the incorrect answer. Like, this was the group that experienced cognitive dissonance.
Right. Getting paid for a task causes you to be confused cognitively.
Absolutely.
Something like that, right? So we would keep going with this conversation. Remember, we're in a group of experienced teachers, and we would just keep listing misconceptions, and then maybe some misconceptions overlap, so we would collapse them into one misconception. We would come up with the list of what we think, as far as we can tell right now, are a comprehensive list of misconceptions, or at least we can't think of any more. If there are 3 of those misconceptions, then you're going to have a 4-answer single diagnostic item. You're always going to have one more possible answer in your single diagnostic item than you have misconceptions. Before you start the process, you don't know how big your single diagnostic item is going to be because you have to figure out how many misconceptions you have. Once you define your list of misconceptions, then the task is writing a multiple choice question where you have a stem across the top, and that stem can be something as simple as which of the following is the best definition of cognitive dissonance, or it can be more sophisticated as which of these is a good example of cognitive dissonance, or it can be a scenario. Eric and Garth were about to do a task. Eric was given an all-expense-paid trip to Tahiti for doing the task, while Garth was just given a pat on the head. And I figure out the rest of the scenario as it is. Which of the following concepts illustrates why? So you can write your multiple choice however you want to. But the point of the matter is you take your list of misconceptions. So we have 3 misconceptions. You write distractors that target each misconception specifically so that there's a one-to-one relationship between the distractor, between a possible answer, and that misconception. Your goal is that when students answer this multiple choice item, what they answer tells you what misconception they're operating under. So in our example, let's say we keep it simple and we say, which of the following is an appropriate definition of cognitive dissonance? And our first misconception is confusion. Then A might read, cognitive dissonance is a general term that refers to confused thinking.
Certainly, yeah.
Right. And we keep going and we write those, and then we have one correct answer, and the correct answer is in the mix there somewhere. And then we can present that item. The goal is you can present that item to students all at once. You can put it up on the board, you can put it on the projector, you can blast it out through your learning management system, you can do whatever you want. But everybody gets that one item at the same time. Everybody responds to that one item at the same time, and the teacher can see the distribution of understanding and specific misconceptions in the classroom, and then can be a responsive teacher and use that information in order to shape the rest of their lesson. So I put the distribution up on the board. So everybody, here's what we responded to as a class. And I know you read about this last night, but we're not converging on the right answer yet. C is technically the right answer, and 58% of you got that. But 25% of you said A. Let's look at A and let's talk about what makes A wrong. How are we thinking incorrectly about cognitive dissonance if we're choosing A? It's important to do this anonymously, I think. so that students don't feel singled out. But you go through, if nobody chooses B, you don't talk about B. If nobody chooses D, you don't talk about D. But you attack misconceptions directly based on empirical data you have about whether students in your class have that misconception.
So this is why I love this technique. This is why I love hearing you talk about this, because it gives you finely detailed information about how your students are processing information and what they understand and precisely what they don't understand. And so when they get an 85 on that multiple choice exam, the 15 that they missed, you can then understand what precisely they missed. It's not that they did miss 15, but you can go look at those 15 items and you can see how they were misthinking, if you will, how they were misperceiving those concepts. They got them wrong, but now you know how they got them wrong, and you can look at trends and patterns. And the trick, the trouble, the challenge is that what you described, they are arduous to create.
Right. So I don't know that you'd want to do an entire exam out of single diagnostic items. That'd be cool if somebody made one, but that would be an incredibly laborious task. The model that I was working towards was a limited number of single diagnostic items that you use in class and everybody takes them all at once. But putting them on an exam is an interesting idea.
Well, how about the first intro psych textbook publisher who actually does the legwork to make this happen is going to offer a free supplement that is going to be worth its weight in gold.
That'd be cool.
Let's volunteer to do that for some publisher. Wouldn't it be fun to sit in a room and just go through those?
Publishers, if you're listening,
wait,
here we are.
We're not volunteering for that, though, are we?
Wait, well,
I said volunteer. I want to be part. What I'm saying is I want to be part of that. Now, I'm thinking about two things. First of all, I use Plickers in my classroom. They're anonymous.
You could
Perfect
do that.
for
Great.
that.
Fabulous.
And it's in fact exactly what I want to do because I know what most of the concepts are that my students struggle with.
Yep.
And I want to use and in fact, I'm doing it to some extent in my classes already, but not getting at those answers. It might just be occurring to me. Oh, students might be picking this answer or that answer, but to make it a kind of a group consensus, these are definitely the biggest misconceptions, I think would be better. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I'm thinking is, I think Brooke and Danae have actually done some research on these misconceptions, these items, and the typical misconceptions, and they have used that and rolled it into some of their book.
Well, I think they know what the most common bottlenecks are and misconceptions. But I think this is a little bit different in that Rob's talking about when thinking about understanding a concept, what are the common mistakes students make in trying to understand that concept, as opposed to what are the most difficult concepts that intro psych students struggle with?
No, I think I'm right. I think they actually have done what you just said.
That'd be cool. Okay. I'd like to see that. That'd be great.
But the thing
they'll correct me if I'm wrong, or you can correct me.
I would never correct you,
at
least not publicly. But the piece that Rob hasn't really mentioned. So in the example, we had 4, 3 plus the 1. But examples that I've seen you give in talks is that that single diagnostic item might have 8. There could be 7 common student misperceptions plus the 8th for the correct. And so these could be, I'm going to use that word arduous again. These could be very lengthy to create.
Yep.
And so that single diagnostic item for cognitive dissonance might have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H.
Yep. And you probably wouldn't want to put that on an exam unless you don't have many items on the exam because it's going to take students a long time to answer the item. But if you're just putting it up on the screen and all students are answering it at once, then they're just answering one item, and that can be pretty time efficient.
Well, now I go back on it. Plickers don't work because you only have 4 items. You're limited.
So you might need a more flexible system.
What is a more flexible system?
Poll
do you know?
EV.
Google Forms. You could do a Google form That, as far as I know, there's no limit on that.
free.
Many LMS systems, I think
Yeah.
Canvas can handle multiple possible answers. So you just got to figure out what tool you're going to use based on the item. It can be something super simple. You could just project the item, and you can have students commit to their own response on a piece of paper. And then you can just collect those and flash through them really fast if you want to.
But the beauty of this system is that it's more than just the student getting it wrong. It's the student getting it wrong, and it tells the instructor how they're getting it wrong or what they're getting wrong. And we rarely know how students are misthinking.
Yep. And probably many of us use short answer or essay responses in order to get at that information, because we know it's important information. We probably often, about big important things, will do short answer essay or longer answer essay, and we see it as the gold standard of whether the student really understands the material, whether they can do it in their own words. And I have no quibble with that. But that's really time consuming and very difficult to do with a large class. So a single diagnostic item might be somewhere between the very limited amount of information, like dichotomous information you get with a traditional multiple choice item. Do students get it right or do students get it wrong? On an essay, you really get a lot of detailed information about how they're thinking about it and whether they really understand the concept. Single diagnostic item may shoot somewhere in the middle. I get information about whether they get it right or wrong, and in what ways do they get it wrong.
So if you do this with students, you figure out in your particular class how students are thinking about this, the misconceptions, major misconceptions. You get this information. What's next? What do you suggest?
Yeah, the other context that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, and the context I've used single diagnostic items in, is figuring out whether the activity that I just did in class had a learning impact. So in intro psych, we love our demonstrations. We love our activities and demonstrations. And there are a lot of resources out there now for activities and demonstrations. As a matter of fact, probably too many. We're flooded with activities and demonstrations. I'm an old man. I started teaching in 1992 psychology, and at the time, one of my main problems was I was scrambling to find activities and demonstrations, and I was using everything that I got. Now it would be impossible for an intro psych teacher to use every activity or demonstration that was available to them. So now the economy's changed. We have an oversupply of activities or demonstrations, so we can be a lot more picky about the ones that we use. I would love if our community evolved into ways of gauging the learning impact of activities and demonstrations and using that as a criteria for choosing which ones we should use again or not. So here's the context. Tomorrow I've got a handout, and maybe we can do a link to the handout and include it in somewhere in here or something like that. I've got 4 common activities that a lot of intro psych teachers use, and I wrote a single diagnostic item for each of those activities. The model's pretty simple. Ask the single diagnostic item before the activity. Ask the single diagnostic item again, same damn item, ask it again after the activity. If there's learning value to the activity, students in the post response should converge on the right answer. In the pre-response, before you do the activity, students will probably be all over the board on the answer. That convergence post-activity is evidence of the learning value of that activity or demonstration. If there's an activity or demonstration that consistently doesn't show any evidence of learning, it might be super fun and super cool, and we might have done it for the last 10 years, but we should probably stop.
And I'm going to add an and to that. And when you look at the post activity, if there's nice convergence, but it's not perfect, which you would never expect, that's the instructor assessment data. Now, this is what I can cover in the class. Or when I come back next semester, I'm going to make a change so that I can make sure that there's even more convergence next time.
Yeah.
So there's that grade piece for students, there's that assessment piece, and you're gonna have some evidence of what works and what doesn't. And I'll go one more. And if you do that systematically enough, you could publish that data in a journal.
Yep.
You could publish that in a Teaching of Psychology, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or Psychology Teaching and Learning. Those are 3 outlets that I think that would be interested in that kind of data.
Yeah, I'm going to share data tomorrow from a really small study I did at Nebraska Wesleyan with this one single diagnostic item related to this one activity. And I used the pre-post model that I just described. I also used a pre-post writing model. So I had students describe the concept in their own terms before the activity and after the activity. And I think I've got data that the writing data confirms what I believe the single diagnostic item data indicate, that the activity has learning value because of the convergence on the response in the single diagnostic item, and the post-writing responses also showed a greater level of understanding.
What was the concept for that particular one?
The concept for that one is working memory.
Okay.
And the activities, I call it Baddeley's 3 systems of working memory. It's one that a lot of people do where people close their eyes and they count windows in a house, or close their eyes and repeat words in a sentence. And it's getting at the different actors in working memory, the central executive, the phonological loop, and the visual spatial sketchpad.
This sounds like something that really we could do well with crowdsourcing. It strikes me that it would be a little bit overwhelming to me to generate 35 single diagnostic items.
Yeah.
To do it well, it strikes me it's a lot of work, it's time consuming. But if 35 people decided to do one, or if there were a mastered list of top 100 items to have single diagnostic data about, and we found 100 people to do it in the fall of the 2019 semester in their classes with at least ends of 100, you could have 100 people collecting data on 100 items. That's 10,000 observations.
I think that'd be potentially really cool. And you could
Share it
you could start with a
publicly.
list of concepts. You could also go the other way and say, okay, everybody bring your favorite psych demonstration, or your top 3 favorite psych demonstrations. Right. We're all going to work on writing single diagnostic items that will look at the learning impact of those psych demonstrations. I would love a world where the next book that comes out with favorite psychology activities or favorite psychology demonstrations, with every single one of those things, there's an assessment, or there's a way to check the learning impact. Maybe a single diagnostic item, maybe a short answer question, maybe something else. I think that would be a really cool book.
Well, there's Project Syllabus that has peer-reviewed syllabi. Why couldn't there be a Project Demonstration that has peer-reviewed, empirically supported, empirically informed demonstrations? Yeah. Where, you take the best of APA SNAP, you take the best of single diagnostic items, and there's actual data that's there. Maybe it's not published in the literature, but it's published in gray literature. It's presented at a conference. It's been verified by a process that is empirical.
So, Rob, in the literature, what is the impact of using this?
There isn't any literature that's specific to intro psych, as far as I know. The literature that I've seen, and I've got some citations in the handout that everybody will have access to, come mostly from physics. Physicists have been interested in misconceptions for quite some time, specifically misconceptions about laws of motion, and we all apparently have some pretty naive beliefs about conservation of motion and conservation of energy and things like that. So those folks have written some single diagnostic items specifically attacking those misconceptions, and they have a whole literature based on how to attack student misconceptions in ways that will actually change their mind. So that's the literature that I'm aware of. I believe there's some in mathematics too, but science and math seem to be where the action is with this right now.
Yeah, the PER folks have always been ahead of us. Physics education researchers have been on the forefront of that for 40 or 50 years. And so I'm thinking of guys like Richard Hake and those folks who were pushing education research way before the psychology folks for the most part. So that doesn't surprise me at all. Yep.
Well, this has been fascinating, and thanks for sitting down and doing this conversation on assessment. And any final words, anybody?
No, I think this is a great kickoff episode. I want to keep having these conversations with different people around the country, and it should be an integral part of what every educator does. We all care about what our students are performing, but we all need to keep getting better. Again, no matter what part of your career you're in, we need to it's part of our professional development to keep improving.
Thanks for this. And in some ways, I think single diagnostic items are unique, and I'm excited about them. There are probably also ways to use all of our traditional assessment formats in similar ways, because it doesn't have to be a multiple choice question. It could be a true-false question. You could have a good, robust true-false question out there, have two decent answers, and I think the important part is the teacher gets the information back, and then that information is returned to the class, and as a class, you metacognate about that, and you do something about understandings and misunderstandings. You could probably do this with matching if we got really creative with it. I know you could do this with a short answer essay. So there's nothing magic about the format, I don't think. The choice about format is probably expediency and efficiency in classrooms. So let's all think more broadly and more critically about the assessment stuff we're already doing in our classrooms and how to use that as isolated items to start useful learning discussions in classes.
I know you wanted to try to close us out. I'm going to gently disagree because I think there is something special about single diagnostic items. I think if you gave a 35 student classroom a short answer item, I think very few instructors will take the time to go back through the students who did not score perfectly and do a content analysis of what were the recurring themes of the misanswered items.
Yeah.
I think with a single diagnostic item, you have built in a priori that you will know how your students are misanswering items.